absolutely honoured to have Dr. Helen Haines as my special guest this evening on tonight's Zoom. For those who don't know me, I'm Allegra Spender. I'm the federal member for Wentworth. If you're not sure where Wentworth is, think Bondi Beach and outwards. That is my beautiful electorate. And Helen Haines is the federal member for Indi. Which I have started to become more and more familiar with since I joined Parliament and heard more about it from Helen. What I wanted to do was start by acknowledging the land on which I'm meeting. So I'm meeting on the land of the Gadigal, Bidjigal and Birrabirragal people, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I was on a panel the other day about national unity, national cohesion. And there was a learned Aboriginal academic called Asmi on the panel, and we were talking about cohesion, and he said, after the Voice, which was disappointing and very disappointing for many Aboriginal people, he said, you'll notice that we spent 2 weeks not saying anything, and that was because our leadership recognised that we shouldn't speak in anger. And I still think that is one of the most wise things I've heard recently, because we could all learn more about not speaking in anger as we try and, continue to navigate and bring, the country together and people together and, work through our differences in constructive ways. I'm super pleased to have Helen here this evening because she has really been a beacon in the Parliament and, someone I followed before I got into politics in terms of her fabulous work, particularly around integrity, as well as around regional leadership. But tonight we're here to talk about integrity and how to bring, how to continually invest in integrity and continually invest in the quality of our democracy. I had many people, particularly after the Voice referendum, which was very strongly supported in Wentworth, can turn about what rampant unchecked misinformation can do to our democracy. I've had many people concerned about, during the campaign, but the whole way through, about how do we make sure that politicians always act in the interests of the country, not in their own personal interests or the interests of their party. And I think real concern that, with some other external forces, including technology change, rise of social media, with foreign interference and other things that, countries around the world and Australia's not immune to this, are going to be driven by polarization, post-truth and populism. And, how do we fight this? How do we continually to invest in our democracy? And how do we continually make sure that our democracy has integrity, that our politicians and our public sector has integrity, enable and that we are strong, I think, in face of some very significant countervailing threats. So that is going to be the topic for discussion with Helen tonight. And, we're doing this together because we were brought, we're independents, but what we do in the Parliament is we work constructively together. We listen and learn from each other, and I've certainly learned a great deal from Helen in my time. And I want to share some of her lessons as well as have a broader discussion between the both of us in relation to integrity in politics. And what we'll be doing tonight is we'll be starting out with, some introductory questions from me to Helen about some of the major themes of integrity. And then we'll be moving to some of the questions that you guys have either previously shared in the RSVP. And if we can get to some from the chat, I will also try and do that. We'll just see how we go for time because we'll be wrapping up swiftly at 8 o'clock. So thank you very much. Let's kick it off. So firstly, for those who don't know Helen, as said, Dr. Helen Haines is a member for Indi. Helen, how would you describe Indi? Where for those of us that aren't Indi, don't know the name, particularly of the federal electorates, how do you describe Indi?
Oh, Allegra, well, thank you. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to have a conversation with you tonight and members of your community and people more broadly who may be joining this evening's event. And before I even begin any comments about where I am, I wanted to recognise where you are and your community are, and to acknowledge the trauma and sadness that you are experiencing and the events that have unfolded about a week ago. So I want to acknowledge that.
Thank you, Helen. I have to say, I really appreciate that. It has been a very hard time for all of our communities. So we're very grateful for your warm wishes and also for, for reaching out, earlier, very close to the terrible tragedy at Bondi Junction when it happened. So thank you, Helen.
Good, Allegra. Indi is a federation seat, which means it was established in 1901 when the federation was constructed. So we're very proud of that, one of the original seats of the parliament.
So is Wentworth.
Yeah, so isn't that nice? 2 federation seats. Indi covers 29,000 square kilometres of beautiful northeast Victoria. It stretches, for anyone who knows something about these little towns, from Marysville, King Lake down in the south of my electorate, which really is almost peri-urban Melbourne these days. And folks who follow bushfire history would know that area of my electorate has been severely impacted by very, very serious bushfires many times, most significantly in 2009 when we had the highest number of deaths ever from a bushfire event, and that was the Black Saturday bushfires. So that's down south. We follow all through the alpine areas. So I have all of the Victorian ski resorts, Mount Hotham, Mount Buller, Falls Creek, magnificent alpine country, right through to the Murray River. Towns such as Corryong, Tintaldra, Midamida, the major centres, Wangaratta, Wodonga, Mansfield, Benalla. It's a significant wine growing area. People who are familiar with the big hearty reds of Rutherglen should come pay a visit to Indi. And we have, of course, a significant history in Italian immigration, which speaks to some of your past, Allegra. And we have magnificent Italian varietal wines which are produced here. So it's a very beautiful agricultural space in northeast Victoria. Tourism is a key part of our economy, and I represent at the moment around 122,000 voting constituents. So it's a big patch, a fabulous patch, and one I'm super proud to represent.
Oh, wow. Helen, thank you so much for that introduction. I feel like I should give a more fulsome intro to Wentworth, but for some contrast, I think my electorate's 39 square kilometres big, so it's one of the smallest electorates in the country. But in terms of size, of physical size, but not in terms of people or in terms of their contribution. But it's interesting, and I think this is one of the joys of Parliament is working with people who represent different communities but find enormous common ground. So for those who don't know Helen didn't start out as a politician. She actually started out as a nurse and a midwife, and has been passionate and active in the world of health and for many, many years. And she was the first independent in Australia's parliamentary history to succeed a previous independent in a federal seat, and that was succeeding Cathy McGowan in the 2019 election, and has since won again in 2022. And so she's, as I said, Helen's contribution to Parliament has been very significant. I think you would be one of the most popular members of Parliament among the parliamentarians, as well as most well respected. But you've always had a very particular focus on integrity, and that's certainly the reason why many of my electorate are familiar with your work. So tell me, Helen, you took in the 2019 to 2022 period in Parliament, you really pushed the government and the opposition at that time to bring forward a National Anti-Corruption Commission, in terms of also actually introducing that legislation yourself and really being a champion for that. And one of the first orders of the work of the government of the Labor government was to bring this into effect, and I know that you were hugely influential in both the development of the NAC and what it looks like. So I'd love you to give us a bit of history. Like, why did you choose the NAC? Why was that important to you? What was your process, and where do you think it is now?
Yeah, thanks, Allegra. Well, the National Anti-Corruption Commission is a piece of work that I'm super proud of, but I am but one of many people, of course, who championed that reform, and it is the most significant reform in the transparency and accountability space in the federal parliament for many, many decades, to be honest. Why did I choose it? There were many times when I thought during the last Parliament, why are you doing this work, Helen? You come from a background in healthcare and public health in particular.
Yeah.
All of my advocacy prior to coming to Parliament was around improving equity and access to healthcare. My research has been around women's and children's health and rural health, so I actually knew nothing consequential about establishing something as complex as legislation for an anti-corruption commission. But what I did know to be true was that the trust in our federal parliament and the trust in public institutions and organisations was severely waning in Australia. On every international measure, we were slipping down the league tables of trust in government. And that has huge implications for us being a country that can take bold steps into the future and make change around things as consequential as scientific action on climate change, on so many elements of public policy. If the population don't trust their government, then it's very hard to bring significant change across the line. I also know that my whole background and past, whether it be living in a rural community, which I've done for most of my life, or operating in the health sphere, means that integrity and trust is fundamental to everything that we do. And it really affronted me that there were aspects of political life in our federal parliament where there was no consequences for poor behaviour. There was no consequence for what seemed like systemic and serious corruption. I was also, of course, pushed to take this up as a key element of my work by the community I represent. So when I was invited by the community of Indi to run for election after Kathy decided she would retire, they said to me, Helen, you need to promise us that you're going to continue the work on integrity. So, of course, I said yes to that. So that's why I pursued it. Now, one of the key elements to being successful in keeping this on the agenda and making it something that really became an election issue in the last election, Allegra, and one that you and the new independents to this parliament took up as part of your election campaign, was that people care about this and that the people of Indi, for example, cared about it enough to really get on board with me and work with me. We put forward petitions that got national attention. We ran community events. One critical community event that I ran early in this campaign for a National Anti-Corruption Commission was held at the old Beechworth courthouse, the very same courthouse that Ned Kelly was tried at. And we constructed a narrative based on a significant historical story that came from our region, and it preceded the Eureka Stockade, and it was around a young miner who was brutally murdered by a police officer back in the gold rush days, and there was no justice for that man. And what was seen to happen was that the government were corrupt. And the people of Beechworth at the time put forward a petition and made a significant change in the democracy in Victoria. So we used that story, and then we constructed a set of principles, which I called the Beechworth Principles. And they were the principles by which any piece of legislation to establish an anti-corruption commission should be judged by. That really gave our community a clear narrative. Not everybody can necessarily engage with really complex legislation, but many people can connect with key principles that underpin good legislation. So we did that. I think the other significant part of the work, and something that I see all of my colleagues on the crossbench doing in any reform space, any legislative space, is working with the whole parliament and using the parliamentary tools that are at our disposal. So I made it my business to make numerous speeches about this. I made it an invitation to every member of the House of Representatives and every senator to meet with me to talk about the legislation that I'd introduced to the parliament. Not everybody took me up on that invitation, but some people did, and people from across the aisles, and we worked together to try and convince our colleagues. And of course, I think for me, from a parliamentary perspective, this reached a very exciting and I think a watershed moment in November 2021, I think that was, when I put a motion to the House to suspend standing orders to bring on debate for my bill. It was during the COVID period, and to the surprise of everybody in the Parliament, Bridget Archer seconded that motion and crossed the floor on that debate. And in fact, we won on the numbers on that day to debate my bill, but it was knocked out on the COVID technicality. But I think the story I'm telling you is it's a long road to trying to bring about reform. As an independent, when people say, what can an independent do? I think it's a very good story, the one of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, to say, while I was not successful in ultimately getting that bill up during the 45th Parliament, during the Morrison government, this became an election issue and was really the first order of business for the new government. And further to that, I am the Deputy Chair of the Oversight Committee of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, again, which is a very rare thing for an independent to have a chair position on any parliamentary committee. So I think this demonstrates really what independence in the Parliament can achieve.
Thank you, Helen. That is a wonderful your perspective. Wonderful story.
Allegra, we're having a few tech difficulties here. I have you frozen in time. I'm not sure if our participants can hear anything, but I seem to have lost Allegra. I'm going to just check out and check back in.
My apologies, everyone. I'm afraid that was some probably technical issue on my side. I'm just going to get Helen back up in terms of allowing her to be to speak up. So where is Helen? Have I lost Helen as well? I feel like I've lost Helen, I'm afraid. Let me just try and contact her and see if Helen. I don't know if she has. Oh, here she is. Let me just change to not panelist. So hopefully I can get Helen back on. Here we are. Helen. My apologies. Helen, would you mind popping off mute and popping on your camera? So told you shouldn't. My team should let me off the leash like this. Apologies. I don't know what just happened to my internet. So tell me, the question I really wanted to ask you was about, which you may have started answering, was just, tell us where the NAC is up to now.
Yeah. Thanks, Allegra. Yeah, I think it could be bandwidth from my end. It's one of the challenges in regional Victoria, actually. I've actually made a few notes, so I'm just going to refer to them here about where we're up to with the NAC. There's been 2,767 referrals received. And referrals to the National Anti-Corruption Commission can be made by anyone. You don't have to have any qualifications to make a referral. That's a lot of referrals, and understandably around 90% of them have been excluded as they're either duplicates or they're not appropriate. They don't actually fall under the remit of the Anti-Corruption Commission, but they get referred on somewhere else, or people are given advice about where their referral actually should go. 15 corruption investigations are currently on foot, which is a significant number. 23 investigations are being overseen or monitored, and remembering that some investigations have translated across from the former body, which was called ACLI, which was a public service investigatory body, and 19 preliminary investigations are underway. So those stats tell you that the National Anti-Corruption Commission is up and running and functioning and actually quite busy. Many people say to me, oh, Helen, but we don't know what's being investigated. Well, that's true. We don't know what's being investigated because you may recall that part of the jurisdiction of the National Anti-Corruption Commission and the legislation that underpins it means that unless an investigation is deemed by the Commissioner, and remembering that this NAC is fully independent of Parliament, is deemed to be in the public interest, then we don't know what's being investigated until such a time that the Commissioner decides we need to know. So that's really important. Some people are disappointed by that, but I do say to members of the public when they talk to me about this, this was never intended to be a popcorn moment for all of us watching on. This is a serious body. These are potentially serious allegations that are made. And that the Commission needs to, of course, give a fair and just approach to the people who are being investigated. But it does remain to be seen at what point the Commissioner decides that something is in the public interest and we need to know about it. So we need to wait and watch that space.
Okay, thank you, Helen, for that update. Look, I know I wanted to move to another area that is a real area of championship from you this year, which is around pork barrelling. I know that's one that you've talked a lot about, and I know that you've also got at the moment you've proposed a bill relating to that. Can you again tell me a bit about why you've chosen this as an issue and what your bill, your proposed bill does?
Thanks, Allegra. So, yeah, establishing the National Anti-Corruption Commission, great milestone, but the work of integrity is far from done. And when we think about fairness and accountability and transparency in public life, the appropriate use of taxpayer monies, of government funds is critical to maintaining trust in our democracy. And what we've seen from governments of all persuasions over a significant period of time is when the whistle's blown on election time, that we see members of government and indeed members of the opposition, but primarily members of government coming into the election, making visits to various seats, particularly marginal seats, and making significant promises when it comes to infrastructure grants. We know that the definition of pork barrelling is when public funds are used for political purposes, not for the purpose of public good. And it's actually really on the nose. One of the things we noticed, of course, in Indi when we successfully changed our political representation in 2013 was, the fierce competition that happened in our seat. And while we welcomed that, we saw that it was actually not right, that there were members of major parties arriving in our patch and promising us all sorts of things, whether it be a new piece of freeway or a new road upgrade or money to a sporting club or whatever it might be to try and buy our votes. And we see this happen all over Australia. So I want to put a stop to this. I want to see that when public monies are being spent, particularly when it comes to infrastructure, that it's done so in a way that's ethical and responsible, and that there are fair guidelines, fair selection criteria, that's transparent to the nation, and that when a minister decides that the recommendations coming from their department on a particular grant are not ones that they wish to fulfil, then they need to come to the Parliament and explain why. So I acknowledge that that ministers of the Crown have a responsibility to expend public monies in a way that they under the remit of their department, under the remit of their ministry, but they need to be accountable for that. So my bill has proposed, and this I think is just such a simple ask, is that when it comes to federal government grants, and there are many, like billions of dollars are expended through grants, that the guidelines are publicly available in a timely way, that the selection criteria are clear and transparent and publicly available. I've put forward that there should be a parliamentary committee that oversees grant expenditures, just like we have parliamentary committees for so many other elements of our parliamentary work, so that the Parliament is actually dealt into this decision making around the expenditure of public monies, and that a minister, should they decide to go against departmental advice, that they come to the Parliament in a timely manner and explain why. Maybe extremely good reasons for that, I think, and that they do so. And that the other element to this is that we include investment mandates. And Allegra, I'm sure many of the people on this call would know that we have significant large future funds, Housing Australia Future Fund, for example, being one that we recently legislated, and that there's an investment mandate for that fund that dictates how monies will be spent. I want to include investment mandates into transparency and accountability so that the minister responsible comes to the Parliament on a regular basis and discloses to us and subsequently to the Australian public how that investment mandate is playing out, and that it's doing what it says it will do.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, there's a lot of it's when I'm out in the community, I think pork barreling is one of the things that my community hates the most, because they have the same sense that money's not being spent where it's needed the most. Money's being spent where it's of political advantage for whoever's sort of pulling the strings. And I think that really gets in people's craw, because I think both from a fairness point of view, but also from an effectiveness point of view. You'll see, a lot of people, when I talk about tax, and obviously tax is a favourite topic of mine, people will say to me, look, I don't mind paying a significant amount of tax, but I do want it to be spent well. And when I see governments wasting money, then I resent paying tax, or I resent paying the amount of tax that I do, because I just feel it's not in the best interest. And I want to make sure that money that I'm not going to get is going to go to where it is needed the most. And so that's why I've been sort of pushing around, similarly, but in a different vein, infrastructure spending, for those large infrastructure spends, those ones that can be, hundreds of millions, if not even billions of dollars, that we need business cases for infrastructure spends. And then that we should be prioritising on the ones that make the strongest case. Because at the same time, it's very easy to say, well, let's give a new road there because we want to win that seat. But if that's not the best place for a new road to go, well, then let's make sure we do put the road where it needs to go as well. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on this at all different levels of grants and other spending. And that sort of spending integrity is something that also just goes down to sort of good economic management and making sure, in a tight budgetary environment, that every dollar we spend actually goes to the greatest difference.
I absolutely agree, and again, this is work that comes from the community asking me to do this work, because you're absolutely right. It's so on the nose. Everyday people out on the streets know this is wrong, and you're right, particularly in a situation that we find ourselves in economically at the moment, where household budget is really tight, and everyday people understand that they spend their money carefully, and they expect that at the very least from their government. So I think this is a bill that isn't in any way radical. I think it's a bill that really deals the Parliament back into the expenditure of public monies. It's not about taking away the mandate from a government to undertake the work that they wish to do as part of their overall policy platform, but it's about saying, here's our plan. It's fair and equitable. There's good reasons for why we're spending money here or there. We've got a strategy when it comes to major infrastructure projects. I mean, at the moment, for example, we look at the Inland Rail project, which is going billions of dollars over budget. And I've done quite a bit of work on that, because the Inland Rail comes through my electorate. And I can tell you that the early work around the feasibility and the planning for this leaves a lot to be desired. And I think there'll be many people on the line tonight who may be engineers or working in the construction industry or major projects more broadly, who'd be pretty horrified if they saw the lack of due diligence that went into such a project.
I've got a couple of questions in the chat which are related to pork barreling, which we could cover now since we're on topic, which is about so what can communities and marginal electorates do to push back against pork barrelling? And also, can the NAC look at pork barrelling? Do you want to make some comments on those ones, Helen?
Yeah. Well, certainly the community can get on board and back my bill. I've got an open letter. You can jump on my website and sign that going to the Prime Minister. You can write. I'm kind of guessing that maybe most people on this line are your constituents, Allegra, but if there's people who are not constituents of Wentworth, write to your MP and ask them to back in this call to end pork barrelling. Write to the Prime Minister, write to the Treasurer, the Finance Minister, all of these people, and say, look, it's not good enough. We don't want it. We don't want to be bought off during elections. We want sensible and strategic spending of public money. So they can do that, exercise your democratic muscle and make your voice heard. I think the other what was the second part of your question?
The second question was, can pork barrelling be referred to the NAC?
Yes, it can.
MPs that did a pork barrelling, could they be referred to the NAC?
Yes, absolutely they can, and get us up to the National Anti-Corruption Commission to determine whether they wish to investigate that further. But I think New South Wales have led the pack really on this, and New South Wales ICAC, of course, did a significant review into pork barrelling and demonstrated quite conclusively that maladministration of public funds when it's systemic and serious is in fact corruption. So this is the thing. Like, I think we've made a bit of a joke about pork barrelling in Australia for a while. We tend to have a laugh when we talk about it. But you can't put lipstick on a pig with this one. This actually, at its worst, at its most systemic and serious, is indeed corruption. So yes, the National Anti-Corruption Commission can look at something in this vein.
Okay, thank you. Just to stick on some broad themes on integrity before we go to some more questions that were submitted in advance. And again, people can add questions to the Q&A, and I'll keep an eye on it. If I can weave them in to the conversation before we get to the other questions section, I will. But talking about just some other areas of interest, I thought we could talk briefly around truth in political advertising. This is something I know that Zali has been really championing, but also Kate. I think even this last week, we've seen misinformation and disinformation actually really be damaging to our communities and to our social cohesion. But I think we've seen that also in politics with misinformation and effectively lies in political advertising. Really influencing elections. Have you seen some of those egregious examples, and how do you feel about lies in political advertising, how important this is to deal with?
Yeah, look, Allegra, this is a really serious issue, and it's deeply distressing as a member of Parliament when there's lies, and they are lies, are spread deliberately to try and influence people's decision making, try and influence the outcome of an election, to try and influence public debate about significant policy. Again, when we come to that issue of trust, and it's why we on the crossbench care so deeply about these issues, is that we can't bring about the changes we need for our nation when our civil society doesn't trust government. I think personally, during election campaigns, or even not during election campaigns, just during the course of a parliament, I've certainly experienced the use of social media and political players making statements that are simply not true around things like voting records and policy positions. So I've felt it personally. More deeply during the referendum, of course, we saw all sorts of misinformation and indeed disinformation spread willfully through social media. And I think right now, as we debate the best way forward in addressing climate change, we're seeing, again, all sorts of information spread. So it really is a handbrake on progress. And I just can't see in any other part of everyday life where we could possibly accept lies in advertising for general consumer consumption. We wouldn't tolerate it. But we seem to be in this situation now in Australia and indeed right around the world. So this is an area of serious concern. The remedy to it is not straightforward. We know that, but there are some mechanisms, there are some levers that can be pulled, and there is some pretty good legislation in South Australia which is addressing this. We know that Zali, again, our crossbench colleague from Warringah, has really taken the lead on this in the Parliament and put forward legislation to address this. Look, at first, my impression was the government said this is all too hard. But my impression now is that indeed the Albanese government does wish to attempt to address this. So I long for some legislation to come to the Parliament to be debated, whether it be Zali's. I'd love to see Zali's debated, or if indeed the government have legislation of their own. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter really, Allegra, does it? So long as we get something done about this and get it done soon before the next election.
I think that's right. And look, actually, I think we are starting to hear at least some positive words or noises coming out of the government in relation to this. So we will be looking very carefully. I think Zali's laid down a great example. And I think one of the great tragedies of the referendum was that Zali suggested to the government very strongly in advance of the referendum that they should have passed the misinformation, they should stop the lies and political advertising before then, and that didn't happen. Now, it's, as you say, it's not a panacea. There's some very difficult forces at work, but I think that, from foreign interference, from the sort of advertising that's, what people can say on social media, which is really not subject to, to any sort of law or to any sort of, in many cases, of defamation or other areas. But at least it would be some of a guard. And I also note that Kate Chaney, who's been really championing electoral reform, has also been working in this space.
Allegra, could I just add that we will do everything we can in our role as representatives in the Parliament, but again, I call on civil society, on our citizenry more broadly, to call this out as well, to push back, to say when it's clear to any of you who are listening tonight that misinformation is being spread, push back. Many people are using social media. If you see something being spread, use whatever democratic muscle you can as well. I think we've all got to be part of the solution here.
Now, before we go to some of the other questions from the floor, I just wanted, we could keep on going on integrity. There's this question of lobbying registers, which is really important, ministerial diaries, some of the work that David Pocock and then Monique Ryan have been working on. There's Jobs for Mates, which is, the work that Sophie Scomps has been really trying to push back on to stop, the political appointments without, merit. And then obviously the work on electoral reform, which is, I think, quite contested and is something we expect to see in the coming months. Which of that, menu of options would you like to sort of either nominate or talk about? Because they're all important areas. It's all areas that the crossbench is working on, and I think achieving some really good results, actually, in terms of things like the lobbying inquiry, some really positive developments in terms of ensuring we get merit-based appointments to the Australian Review Tribunal. Did you want to comment on any of those, Helen, before we?
Yeah, I would. And again, I'd like to say, when I hear out in the community, what can an independent do? Well, you've just listed off a suite of reforms that are being led by the crossbench with success. So the Administrative Review Tribunal, I think, is a really good example. The crossbench pushed back very hard to the Attorney-General around the appointments process for this new piece of legislation, knowing full well that the AAT had been taken apart by the Attorney-General because of the problems with cronyism and really inappropriate appointments to that board. And then we found the legislation of the new board wanting, when it came to the appointments process. The crossbench worked really effectively with the Attorney-General to remedy that and to remedy it in the House of Representatives where it needed to be remedied before it went across to the Senate. That would not have happened without strong advocacy from the crossbench. So a big tick there. And I think this inquiry into the lobbyists is a really critical piece of work too. Look, major parties would rather turn a bit of a blind eye, I think, to this. It's difficult areas of reform. But the crossbench have been diligent and very constructive around a solution to some of these issues of political influence. And it truly is a problem when we haven't got eyes on who has influence in ministerial offices or who has the power to walk the halls of Parliament and have a lot to say about particular policies and positions on major issues. So this is crossbench work. I think that congratulations really to David and Mon who are leading the charge on the lobbyist work. Sophie Scoms has done such good work on the Jobs for Mates legislation that she's put forward to the Parliament and keeping the pressure on. So, and Kate, of course, with electoral reform. And the bill that she's put to the Parliament is an omnibus bill, really, with a whole suite of reforms that would, again, give greater transparency to who's influencing our politicians and who's influencing the outcomes of elections.
I think that's right. It's as you say, it's a team sport. I think integrity on the crossbench, and one I think we're all really proud to work together and support each other on, and really and be, I think, biggest cheerleaders, but also proponents, because I think a single voice can when it's backed up by others across the Parliament, really raising it with our constituencies becomes even more powerful. Look, I'm going to go to a couple of questions that we've had from the floor, which has been about one looks like more of a comment, but one is about which is it's a quote from you. You're being quoted back, which is, when you're an independent, you are never in opposition, which I thought was is a wonderful quote, and that's from you, Helen, apparently. So
yes, that is one of mine, I think. Yes.
Yeah, that's a great
It's true
quote.
though. I think we come to the Parliament willing to work with whoever's in government, and again, I say to people who are students of the Parliament, don't just look at question time. Look at the consideration in detail process of legislation. And Allegra, I've got to say, you are one of the best parliamentarians when it comes to consideration in detail and debating backwards and forwards with ministers to try and improve bills. That's the way a parliamentarian should operate. It shouldn't just be about calling out governments or saying things aren't right. It's actually about putting forward common sense, good faith amendments and then arguing for them in the Parliament. So it's a great, I think consideration in detail debates are terrific to watch.
Yeah. Well, no, I agree, and it's for those who aren't so close to Parliament. Once you have your sort of main speeches, consideration details, where you get to debate and have a conversation with the minister about either amendments or about questions on the bill itself. And I think that I feel like on the crossbench, what we're doing is bringing that back actually to what it should be, which is a debate about the merits of a bill. Because that's what we are there to do, which is to make bills better. And I think when you say you're independent, you're never in opposition. You work with the government of the day, but I've seen you work across the Parliament, Helen, because it's not just about the government. It's actually about the rest of it's about the opposition. It's about the rest of the crossbench. It's with the Senate, because there are many ways very effectively you have to work to make the biggest changes that you want to see. So that was a great quote from someone. And then we've got another question, which is, given the next election is already on the horizon, what are the most important characteristics a potential community candidate should bring to become a successful independent MP? What's your view on that? I can add my 2 cents after that.
Gosh, it's a big question, but I say to people I meet around Australia that there are so many good parliamentarians walking the streets of Australia who don't know that they could be such an effective parliamentarian. I think that's what I would say, that there is no template or carbon copy of who would make a great representative in the Parliament. What we're seeing, I think, in this Parliament is, of course, the biggest crossbench since Federation. Thrilled about that. We're seeing more women in the Parliament than we've seen before, and we're seeing greater cultural diversity. So all of those things need to be there to have an effective Parliament. I think, though, what I've certainly learnt as I work with my crossbench colleagues and interact with MPs across the board is a great representative is one who is doing the work of the people, not doing the work of the party, and listening carefully to your community and understanding what the key issues are. And of course, there's multiple issues, and trying to triage those into the ones that you can actually do something about. Of course, takes some skill and some teamwork and some great communication around what you can do work on and what you can't, or what you can't kind of fit into one parliamentary term, but you have a long-term view on. So a great listener, I think, coming from any background really. There's no specific background that you should come from, but bringing with you the capacity to work with a team, to be solution focused, and to be really transparent and constantly reporting back to your community. And I think being able to explain how you come to the decisions that you do come to when you ask to vote on a particular issue in the parliament is a critical characteristic. We don't always get it right. There's times when we really wring our hands trying to make a decision that we think our community would be supportive of. And I think the critical part of that is certainly in my 5 years of being a member of parliament, is my community at times will say to me, didn't agree with you on that one, Helen, but thanks for the rationale, and I can see how you came to that decision. So I think that capacity to be honest about why you did what you did in the parliament is really important.
I think that's right. And I think what I often will say to people is experience of life outside of politics is a really good thing. Personally, I mean, I think there's a space for those who've spent most of their life in politics, or in as a staffer or something like that. But I do think you bringing real world experience to the parliament, I think, is of huge value, because I think it's easy. I find this, even just being in parliament for 2 years, it's too easy to forget what it's like to, work in a store that you're, going to be subject to different pieces of legislation on, or run a small business, or, be a doctor or be a nurse in an environment. It's, I think in parliament, you have all these sort of bills that come your way, you have this sort of high level policy, but if we're not constantly interrogating, what does this mean on the ground? What does this actually mean on the day-to-day basis on people's lives, then I think that we're not doing our job. So I think having a diverse diverse and significant pre-parliamentarian experience, I think is really valuable. And then I think another piece I would say is builds on what you said, which is listening and being able and willing to listen to diverse voices, because I know in my community there are varied voices, and sometimes parts of my community disagree very strongly with each other, and that's difficult. But I think being able to, I think, at least listen, consult with experts, not having to be the expert on all things, but being willing to sort of take advice, but consult also with your community, I think is super important. And wanting to be part of the community and be a community leader, because I think what you do is both you're a parliamentarian, but I think particularly I think a lot about my experience in the last week or so, it's not been about being in parliament, it's actually just been about being in the community, trying to understand what the community needs right now, and being then the biggest champion for what the community needs, as well as just physically being there for people. So I think those are some of the things that I think are really important in Parliament as well. I've got some other questions here. Correct, yes, here we are. I've got some other comments as well. They need to be courageous, articulate and caring, and things like that, which is also really important. We're going to go to, let's talk a bit about the fossil fuel lobby, because I think that's, and I guess more broadly about, actually, sorry, I'm going to jump to a different question, because there are some other ones that came in before that I want to get to. One question was to say, are you seeing any positive behaviours by your fellow parliamentarians that community members can acknowledge and reinforce? Because it's good to commend positive behaviour changes. And I thought that was a really good question, because I mean, I've certainly, talking to people in the parliament who've been there for a myriad of time, they've told me things have gotten better. But Helen, what have you seen in your time?
Well, I think this is a lovely question, and thank you for whoever put that. Um, it 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 has been a pretty hostile environment in the Australian Federal Parliament, and we've seen that play out in all sorts of publicly exposed stories. I think a lovely example I saw recently was during the Dunkley by-election when tragically the member for Dunkley, Peter Murphy, who started Parliament at the same time as I did, and who I know, Allegra, you knew a little bit as well, was a marvellous woman and a fantastic MP, and the whole Parliament deeply saddened by her death. And the new member for Dunkley was duly elected, and I saw the neighbouring electorate of Flinders, Zoe Mackenzie, who's a member of the Liberal Party. Zoe did a lovely congratulations to the new Labor member for Dunkley, and talked about how together as two women in politics they can, work in a really positive way for their communities which neighbour each other. She got some pretty nasty pushback from some members of the coalition for being so positive and effusive in her congratulations to the new member for Dunkley. However, I saw one of her colleagues, Keith Wallahan, also first-time MP, stand in support of Zoe and say this is exactly the kind of behaviour that we should be seeing in our parliamentarians. And the pair of them, I think, were a really good example of the kind of behaviours we want to see in the Parliament. And that's irrespective of what party you represent, congratulating a new member of Parliament, where it's sensible and to work together for community good. We should do that. That shouldn't be party specific. So I really wanted to identify that, because I think Zoe did a really good thing, and I think that Keith, in his support of Zoe, showed, no, you know what, people in my own party, you're wrong about this. What Zoe's done is the right thing. So I think that's just one little example of something that's happened recently in the public arena, where I saw some really positive behaviour from two members of the coalition that I really back in. I think just generally around the halls of Parliament, I think things are better. I think people are more, certainly it's more alive in their mind around the treatment of staff in particular. I think we've seen changes in our parliamentary procedures whereby there's no votes taken after 6:30 p.m, which means that staff can go home to their families, and MPs, if they're lucky enough to have families close by, can go home. Some of those systemic changes are really important for making the place a better workplace.
I think that's right. And as a new MP, I know a lot of people ask me, particularly as a woman, what's it like? Are you there? Do you, and what I've said is that I've actually felt incredibly supportive. Now, I think I'm surrounded by sort of strong women, and that I think certainly makes it very that's very affirming and very helpful. And I've certainly seen examples, on the floor and other things of sexism. But I think that, what I hear from people who've been in Parliament for a number of parliamentary terms is that there is a seismic shift, particularly in relation into some of this culture, because when you think about women, at the last Parliament it was 36% women. This Parliament's 45% women. It's the single biggest jump in terms of proportion of parliamentarians that are women that the Parliament has ever seen. And so it's a really so I think that culture, while there is still, I think, when you look around the leadership, there are a lot of men, of all the major parties and the minor ones too. You are seeing, I think, more broadly, I think women and as you said, cultural diversity and actually age diversity as well is we're starting to play up more and more. And I think that just makes it a richer Parliament, a Parliament that better represents the country as well. I'm going to talk a bit about I feel like I've just touched on the gender equity piece, one of the questions. Do you want to talk about political donations briefly, Helen? Because there's a question here about staffing of MPs, and could the changes to the sort of government's sort of electoral reform, could they influence what happens to independent MPs? But also, what about things like fossil fuel donations? Is that something that we should be considering in electoral reform? I'm happy to provide my perspective on that. But Helen, do you want to give a perspective on your views on electoral reform and how that influences both roles of independents and minor parties, but also roles of lobbying interests such as fossil fuels?
Yeah, I think that it's clear to me that we need significant reform in the transparency of political donations. In a healthy democracy, anyone should be able to donate towards the election or re-election of a person or persons that they wish to see in the federal parliament. That's fine and a good part of democracy. We know it costs money to run an election campaign, but we should know who those people are, and we should know in real time. And we should have a system that in some way puts a handbrake on one person or one group or select numbers of groups that have an unequal capacity to influence the re-election or the election of someone because of their capacity to pay. So, the kind of uber influential donation of a Clive Palmer, I think in no one's mind is that seen as being a good thing. And so we need to have some reform that can put a handbrake on that. In my own little camp, real-time donation disclosure, I do for any donation $1,000 or above $1,000. I think if an independent candidate with a small little election team can do that, then the major parties can too. So we should be able to see that straight away. We shouldn't have to wait till a year or 18 months after an election to know who donated to a political campaign. That's an easy reform to make, I think. And we need to be really honest with the Australian public about what is a donation. And there's lots of ways of getting money into an election campaign that never see the light of day because of the way our election rules are set. So, things like purchasing tickets to a dinner, being a member of a particular association, third-party entities, and so on, that needs a clean-up, no question in my mind. We need to level the playing field. We know that incumbency gives enormous advantage, so it's harder for new players to enter the field. That's why, again, we need to be careful in our reform that we don't make it more difficult for new players. So things like political donations, caps and political electoral spending are two areas that clearly need reform, but I think they need careful consideration about how we do that so that we don't inadvertently disadvantage new players.
I think you're right, because I was saying one other piece when you were talking about what's different in the parliament. Something I've heard from a lot of people from the major parties is there's no longer anything, there's no such thing as a safe seat. And that's, I think, I've been really clear, I think that's a great thing. Nobody should go to bed going, you know what, this seat's mine for as long as I want it. They need to always be going, okay, how do I best serve my community? Because if you're not worrying about your seat, then you're not actually beholden or really listening to the community. If you don't feel that happens, and I think that competition, I think, is super important at the seat level. I think you're right. We have to find ways to, and I think it's a bit complicated, how to make sure that you are able to, as sort of minor parties or independents or other parties can evolve and develop over time. So, you don't, for instance, only just say, okay, we'll just publicly fund elections, but only the, people who've already won before can get money in the future. I think there's a real cost to that. But at the same time, wanting to curb the influence of big money, and Clive Palmer's one of them, and I know that, and that's certainly I think is a really important part of it. I think a number of people have said some of the individual donors to mine and other campaigns, they're exercised a lot of that was a big amount of money. Should that have been allowed? And I think there's some good questions to be asked about what's a maximum donation. Should there be a maximum donation to make sure that people can influence, have a make a contribution to campaigns, and campaigns are difficult and expensive to run, but they don't have undue influence. And I think, that's the balance that we're trying to strike. And certainly the concern, I think, that has been raised around fossil fuels, consultancy is another one where if people have significant government contracts, is it appropriate for them to be able to, make significant political donations? One that's come up in this parliament is gambling donations, where we saw, Minister Rowland accept just before the election significant gambling donations from gambling companies, even though she was most likely going to be the minister who was in charge of regulating those gambling companies herself. And I think she has since said, look, I'm not going to take any more donations from these companies, which I think is the right thing. But I think from the outset, I think there's some real concerns from there. Look, I'm afraid that we have run out of time, and I know we haven't covered all the questions, either the early ones I had or the ones in the chat. But I am also conscious it's a Monday evening, and we've already got you either sort of scoffing down your dinner or something else. So I don't want to keep you from home any longer, Helen, but it's been an absolute joy as always to see you, and love hearing your wise words, and again, love to listen and learn from you. And thank you everyone who's joined us tonight and provided, I think, really thoughtful and useful questions, because integrity in politics, integrity in our political system, and defending our democracy, making sure that actually we invest in our democracy, I think is hugely important work. And I think, Helen, you've been an absolute trailblazer in this regard, and one that I'm very proud to sit alongside in terms of when I sit down in Parliament as well.
Allegra, look, thank you for the opportunity to meet with you tonight and to attempt to answer some of those really thoughtful and terrific questions from people who are online. My best wishes to you and to your community, and I look forward to us getting back to Parliament for the budget. And let's see what surprises the Treasurer may have in store for us there. And long may we all collectively, us who have the great honour and privilege of being members of Parliament, but more broadly the citizens of Australia who really exercise their democratic muscle to keep us to account and to call governments of all stripes to account, and make sure, as you say, that our democracy is as strong as it possibly can be. So thanks very much, and see you in Canberra.
Thanks everyone. Take care.